Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Beitzah Daf Chaf begins with a brief comment about somebody who's trying to apply two kedushos to one animal at the same time, which we had said does not work. Then the Gemara moves into a lengthy discussion of the two machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. One machlok is as to whether or not you do smicha on an animal which you are bringing as a carbon shlamim on Yom Tov, and the other about whether you can bring a carbon ola on Yom Tov. So the Gemara first has said that you cannot apply two kedushas of two karbonos to an animal, even if you apply them both at the same time. Two things aren't chal at once. So the Gemara discusses somebody who tried to do something similar. The Gemara says that there was a man who was sick and he felt that he was dying, and he therefore said to someone near him, take 400 zuz and marry my daughter. Now the halacha is that a shchiv, a person who gives a gift because he's about to die, that gift is considered to be given, even if though it's just a verbal statement, and it has to go. But over here the halacha is, says Rav Papa, the 400 zuz belong to the man, but he does not have to marry the daughter. He could choose whether to marry the daughter or not. And that's because the first statement was, take the 400 zuz. That part is chal, that part sticks. Marry my daughter, that part doesn't necessarily stick, because that doesn't necessarily follow. The man has the choice to marry the daughter or not. If ever he had said, marry my daughter and take 400 zuz, then the 400 zuz would be dependent on the marrying of the daughter, and he could not take the 400 zuz without marrying the daughter. Okay, now the Gemara comments on the sugya of whether you're allowed to say two things at once. The Gemara says that Mareimar said over this sugya in his own name, as his own chiddush, that you cannot say two things at once. The Gemara comments that Ravina said that we heard that as a question that Rish Lakish asked Rav Yechanan, and Rav Yechanan answered, we didn't hear that as it was something from you. Okay, now the Gemara moves into the machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. So the first machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai was discussing if you have a mitzvah to do smicha on a carbon that's brought on Yom Tov. Now, a carbon brought on Yom Tov, Beis Shammai holds only a carbon shlomim can be brought on Yom Tov, and Beis Shammai says you don't do smicha, and Beis Hillel says you do smicha. Again, smicha is part of the procedure of bringing a carbon where you lean your full weight on the animal. It's a potential isser d'Rabbanan, and Beis Shammai therefore says you don't do it on a carbon brought on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel says that you do it. Now, Rav Yitzchak bar Abba understands that the machlokes is not about Yom Tov. Machlokes is whether a carbon shlomim that is an obligatory carbon, that is a shalmei chova, which is a chagiga or shalmei simcha, that you have to bring, is there a mitzvah of smicha on that or not? According to Beis Shammai, you don't do smicha because there is no mitzvah of smicha on that at all. Now, where does the Torah tell us that you have to do smicha? The Torah says smicha by an optional carbon shlamim and by an optional carbon ola. That's olas nedava and olas shlamim. Both of them the Torah says you have to do smicha. Rav Yitzchak bar Abba learns that according to Beis Hillel, you learn from an optional shlamim to an obligatory shlamim that you do have to do smicha, and that's why Beis Hillel says he do smicha on the obligatory shlamim on Yom Tov, and Beis Shammai does not learn from the optional shlamim to the obligatory shlamim. So the Gemara says that a brisa was said over in front of Rav Yitzchak that has a limud, a pasuk that tells me that you learn from an optional carbon ola that you do have to do smicha on an obligatory carbon ola. Again, this is not talking on Yom Tov. According to Beis Shammai, there is no such carbon. But this brisa says over the limud as follows. It's from a pasuk in the Shivisimei Milum of the Mishkan. It says, "Vayakar v'sa'ola v'yaseh kamishpat." They brought the ola, and they did it according to the rule. According to what rule? According to the rule that's stated explicitly by a carbon olas, nenova by an optional carbon ola, that you do have to do smicha. Says this brisa, you learn from this pasuk, it's teaching you that you learn out of a carbon olas nidava, an optional ola, that you do have to do smicha even by an obligatory ola. That's the brisa. Says Rav Yitzchak, this has to be going according to Beis Shammai, because according to Beis Hillel, we know that you don't need a pasuk to learn from an optional carbon to an obligatory carbon, because by a carbon shlamim you can learn from an optional carbon to an obligatory carbon, and therefore by carbon ola I should be able to do the same thing. I should be able to learn from an optional carbon ola to an obligatory carbon Ola that smicha is required, and I don't need a pasuk to teach me that. Therefore, this price has to be going in Beitzah Shammai. According to Beitzah Shammai's opinion, we see in our Mishnah you don't do smicha on a obligatory carbon shlamim. That's because you don't learn it from an optional carbon shlamim where it's stated explicitly. Therefore, you would not have a limud from an Ola to an Ola either. You need this pasuk to teach me that you do make that limud. That's how Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba said that this Mishnah must be going according to Beitzah Shammai. So the Gemara asked on him. The Gemara said, how do you know? Maybe Beis Hillel does not learn. Maybe really you're right in your understanding of the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beis Shammai, that it's whether or not you have to do smicha by a obligatory carbon shlamim, but it's not because of the limud from an optional carbon shlamim to an obligatory carbon shlamim. Maybe it's that Beis Hillel learns from an obligatory carbon ola to an obligatory carbon shlamim. And that's how he knows, that's how Beis Hillel know that you have to do smicha by an obligatory carbon shlamim. But the carbon ola is learned, you learn from the ola schova, from the obligatory ola to the obligatory shlamim. How do you know by the obligatory ola you have to do smicha? It doesn't say it. That's learned from the optional carbon ola. And maybe that comes from this pasuk itself. Maybe that's how Beis Hillel knows it. This is the pasuk that teaches me that limud, and therefore this brisa is according to Beis Hillel. How do you know to say otherwise? So Gemara says that that wouldn't make so much sense, because if that was true, what would be the reason that you would not learn from the optional shlamim to the obligatory shlamim? Because the optional shlamim is much more commonly brought than the obligatory shlamim. There aren't too many obligatory shlamims. They're only really the carbon chagiga, which comes rarely. Well, if that's true, then you can also say a reason that you wouldn't learn from a obligatory ola to an obligatory shlavim, and that is because the obligatory ola is fully burnt and the obligatory shlavim is not. So I have reasons to exclude both. So according to you, if there is a reason that he couldn't learn from the optional shlamim, there also should be a reason that he couldn't learn from the obligatory ola. Someone says, no, it could make sense. You learn from the two together. You learn from the obligatory ola together with the optional shlamim that the factor of commonness, of frequency, is not a factor, and the factor of being fully burnt is not a factor. You learn from between the two that neither of those are the factor, and therefore you don't need either of those to be requiring smicha, and that's how we know that an obligatory shlamim requires smicha. Either way, though, we would still need, Beis Hillel would still have to hold that you can learn from an optional ola to an obligatory ola. And therefore, this would not fit with Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding, with Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba's understanding, and you couldn't necessarily say that this Mishnah has to be Beis Hillel and not Beis Shammai. The Gemara now questions Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding of the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai at all. Rabbi Yitzchak's understanding was that the machlokas over whether or not smicha is required altogether on an optional on an obligatory shlamim. So the Gemara says that's not the machlokas. Beis Shammai agrees that smicha is required. Beis Shammai just says the smicha does not have to be close to the shchita. Smicha could be well before the shchita, and therefore you could do smicha before Yom Tov, and there's no reason to do smicha on Yom Tov. The Gemara quotes a brisa where Rabbi Yossi sets up the machlokas Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai that way explicitly, and therefore both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agree that you have to have a smicha on a obligatory carbon shlamim. Just Beis Shammai says you could do it well before, so do it before Yom Tov. So Gemara says, okay, that's one version, but there's a different brisa. And it says over the machlokas the way Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba said it, that the machlokas is whether you require smicha altogether or not, and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba was going with that particular machlokas. And now the Gemara quotes two incidents, a brisa that quotes two incidents. The first one says it's a story with Hillel HaZaken, who's Hillel, who brought a carbon ola to the Azara, and he wanted to do smicha on Yom Tov. Now, this is two problems according to Beis Shammai people. Beis Shammai says you cannot bring a carbon ola on Yom Tov, and you don't do smicha on Yom Tov. But they didn't see him doing smicha. They didn't see him doing smicha. But the Talmidim of Shammai came and they said, "What are you doing here with this animal?" They were concerned that he was bringing a carbon ola, which you're not allowed to bring according to them. Hillel held you are allowed to, but they held you're not. So he said he lied for the sake of peace, and he said it's a female. And a female can be a carbon ola, so it's got to be a carbon shlamim. No, it's not a female. But he switched the tail, he shook the tail as if he was about to show them that it's a female, but they turned around and walked away because they saw that he meant what he was saying, and they walked away. Now, that day, Beis Shammai was stronger than Beis Hillel, and they wanted to set up the halacha as being firmly like Beis Shammai over Beis Hillel. But one of the Talmidim Moshamli knew that that was not the halacha. His name was Bava ben Buta, and he went out to establish that the halacha is really like Beis Hillel. He sent and he brought all the sheep of Kedar, very high quality sheep, to Yerushalayim, and he stood in the Azara, and he said, anybody who wants to do smicha, come do smicha. According to a different version, he said, anybody who wants to bring a carbon ola, could bring a carbon ola. That day, the strength of Beis Hillel was stronger, and they set the halacha like Beis Hillel for all time. There was another instance that happened. It was a Talmud of Beis Hillel to brought a carbon ola to the Azara to do smicha, same thing. Again, the Talmidim found him and they started up with him, and they saw him doing smicha, and they said, what are you doing smicha? So he said, what are you being quiet? Meaning to say, this is not the proper quiet. They were saying this is not a proper smicha. He was saying this is not a proper silence on your part. Meaning to say, the halacha is like Beis Hillel, so what are you complaining about? So they took the hint and they walked away. So it says that Abai commented and says, you see that a Tzorva Mirabanan, a Talmud Chacham, who is accosted by somebody, should only answer in the way that he's attacked. That's what happened here. They accosted him and he responded in the same way that he was attacked. The Gemara now turns its attention to the Machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai as to whether or not you're allowed to bring a carbon olas re'iyah. That is an obligatory carbon ola on Yom Tov. The Gemara has two versions of Beis Hillel's argument to Beis Shammai. In the first version, Beitzah Shammai has a response, and there's a whole conversation. In the second version, that response is eliminated. So the first version goes as follows. Beis Hillel says there's a kal v'chomer from Shabbos to Yom Tov. Shabbos, it's forbidden to eat, but you're allowed to bring obligatory karbanos. So Yom Tov, when it's permitted to eat, you should certainly be allowed to bring obligatory karbanos. Now this is phrased as follows. If you're allowed to eat, so then you should certainly be allowed to have kaviyachal food l'gvaya. You should be allowed to serve karbanos to Most High. So if you're allowed to eat on Yom Tov, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, then obviously eating is more permitted. So on Shabbos, when you're not allowed to eat, you're still allowed to serve karbanos ke'ilu to Most High. So on Yom Tov, when you're allowed to eat, you should certainly be allowed to serve karbanos to Most High. So on this, Beis Shammai responds, and Beis Shammai says that's obviously not a good kal v'chomer, because you see that in Dharma and Davos, that's optional karbanos, are forbidden on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to bring optional karbanos on Yom Tov. You yourself, Beis Hillel, agree to that. Therefore, this kal v'chomer obviously cannot be true, because according to what you're saying, you should be allowed to bring any type of carbon on Yom Tov. You should be allowed to bring optional karbanos as well, and you're not. So Gemara says Beis Hillel responded to that argument and said that that's different because that doesn't have to be brought on Yom Tov. It could be brought any other time. It doesn't have a fixed time. You should bring it some other time. So the Gemara says, Beis Shammai says, but the olas re'iyah, the obligatory carbon ola, which has to be brought on the regel, that's also not a fixed time because you could bring it any day of Yom Tov. It doesn't have to be brought on Yom Tov. It could be brought on Chol Hamoed, and therefore it's not a fixed time. You should bring it any other time. Beis Hillel responds, and Beis Hillel says, no, that's called a fixed time. It has to be brought on Yom Tov. It can't be brought after Yom Tov, so that is also called a fixed time. And therefore, it has to be brought on Yom Tov, and it's permitted to be brought on Yom Tov. It's different than the optional karbanos, which could be brought optional Yom Tov, which could be brought after Yom Tov. Now, the other version of this is phrased slightly differently. This one comes from Abba Shaul. Before Abba Shaul, the Gemara says that Beis Shammai asks, what does the Torah mean when it says that lochem? You're allowed to eat lochem. You yourself are allowed to eat. You're allowed to cook to eat on Yom Tov. That seems to imply you, but not gavoa. You, and not to cook or slaughter or do malacha to serve to Most High. On that, Beis Hillel answers and says, no, it's lochem v'lo l'kusim. It's you and not to feed to the kusim. Okay, now Abba Shaul's version is that it's read as follows. On Shabbos, when your oven is closed, your master's oven is open, meaning you can bring karbanos on the mizbeach even though you yourself can't cook. So on Yom Tov, when your oven is open, you're allowed to cook. Certainly the oven of your master, meaning the mizbeach, should be open for karbanos. Now, in this version, very similar to the previous version, in this version, Beis Shammai doesn't respond. So the Gemara asks, what's the difference between this version and the previous version? The Gemara says, according to this version, Beis Shammai says that Beis Shammai understands that Beis Hillel allows even optional karbanos on Yom Tov. All types of karbanos, even karbanos shlomim that are optional, are allowed in Yom Tov, and therefore they have no response, and therefore that entire conversation does not take place at all. So now what we end up with is two versions as to what Beis Hillel holds about optional karbanos shlomim on Yom Tov. Are they able to be brought or not? So the Gemara says that Rav Huna says that according to the one who says that they cannot be brought, it's an Isser D'Oraisa. Don't think that it's an Isser D'Rabbanan, that D'Oraisa you're allowed to bring optional Karbanos, but the Rabbanan forbade it because they didn't want people leaving their optional Karbanos, their Nedarim and Nedavos, that is, animals that they consecrated to bring as a carbon. They didn't want people to leave them until Yom Tov so that they could bring it when they came to the Beis HaMikdash anyway. And therefore they made it forbidden to bring those Karbanos on Yom Tov. And the reason that they didn't want people to leave it around is lest they come to work it by accident. Do not think that's the reason. That's not the reason. It's an Isser D'Oraisa to bring Karbanos on Yom Tov, not just an Isser Rabbanan. And the proof is from the Shtei Alechem, the two breads that have to be brought on Shavuos. That is not something you have to worry about delaying, because you can't possibly make it any other time. It has to be made for Shavuos. And you're not allowed to bake that on Shavuos. So you see that the Karbanos do not push away the Malachos of Yom Tov. Now the Gemara has a question. What happens, according to the opinion, that you're not allowed to bring Karbanos, optional Karbanos on Yom Tov? What happens if one does go ahead and brings an optional carbon on Yom Tov? Are you allowed to continue and put the blood on the Mizbeach? So Gemara says that Rava says you're allowed to put the blood on the Mizbeach, and that permits you to then eat the carbon. Rabbi Huna says you're allowed to put the blood on the Mizbeach, and that permits you to burn the sacrificial parts on the Mizbeach. Gemara says, what's the difference? According to the first version, it has to be that the parts that you eat are edible. If those parts became tamei or lost, you would no longer allowed to put the blood on the Mizbeach. Putting the blood on the Mizbeach is viewed as a prerequisite to allowing the eating, either people eating the carbon or the Mizbeach burning the parts. So according to the first version, you need the human edible parts to be available. If you just have the burning parts, that's not enough. According to Rabba Bar Rav Huna, though, even if you had just the burning parts, that would be enough. You could put the blood on the Mizbeach anyway. He asks a question from the sheep, the Kevasim of Shavuos, where it says that if they were slaughtered Shaloi Lishma, for the wrong purpose, or if they were slaughtered before the right time or after the right time. So there it says you're allowed to put the blood on the Mizbeach, and you're allowed to eat the meat. However, if it was brought on Shabbos, you're not allowed to. And if you did, it's okay, and you're allowed to continue as long as it was for the purpose of putting the burning parts on the Mizbeach. So here you see, only if you did it already is it permitted for the purpose of putting the burning parts on the Mizbeach, but you're not allowed to go ahead and put the blood on the Mizbeach for the purpose of burning. Meaning, if all you have left to do is burn the sacrificial parts, you cannot lichatchila go and put the blood on the Mizbeach if all that's left to do. If you did it already, it's alright. But to go ahead and actually, if you ask in advance, can I go put the blood on the Mizbeach? Now we'll say that's only allowed if you have parts left to be eaten. So it's a proof to Rabba Bar Rav Huna. That's a proof to Rava against Rabba Bar Rav Huna that you need to have lechatchila, you need to have the eating parts available. So Gemara says either it's a good kasha, or it's different because this is a violation of Shabbos, and therefore you have stricter rules as opposed to the last argument between Rava and Rabba Bar Rav Huna, where it was only a question of a violation of Hilchos Yom Tov.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.